Welcome to the Westminster Effects Doxology Podcast, where we exist for the glory of God and the tone of his people. I'm Cody Fields, the president of Westminster Effects. Go buy stuff for your guitar at westminstereffects.com and join the discussion in the Westminster Effects Doxology Podcast Lounge on Facebook. And you know the drill: subscribe, comment, share it in your stories, and all that good stuff. And tell your mom about it too. I am joined in person by...
Hey everybody, Bradley Cox, pastor at Resurrection Church in Greer, South Carolina.
And via the interwebs by...
John Ross, Westminster Effects artist, the Admiral of Augsburg from Lincoln, Nebraska.
And we have a special guest with us. Welcome Kyle Hessler to the show.
Glad to be here. Kyle Hessler, owner and founder of the Workspace Conference and sales rep at Page 50 and a bunch of other things. But I at least want to plug Page 50 since they're a friend.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we had Stuart Amadon on, a couple months ago to talk about a statement that he made as being a pastor of his church, dealing with the local situation. So we met Kyle at the Fight Laugh Feast conference last year, and we've basically been in touch since. So now you're putting on a conference. First of all, we got to address this name. So to quote,
yeah, you've got a Lutheran here on the thing and Workspace. Come on, man.
Yeah, even better.
Yeah. So I have a lot of questions. Number one, how dare you? So how dare you call something works-based?
Because I read my Bible.
Okay, so now you got to really explain this to the Lutheran that we have.
Yeah.
Oh, easy.
So do you want the theological version, or do you want the story, or how should I proceed?
However you want to go, lay it on us.
So okay, so we're thinking about doing this conference that's about work and dignity, vocation, investing, all that sorts of stuff. And so I'm like trying to figure out names, and there's a lot of like kingdoms builders and like things like that. So I was like, it's kind of trite. And well, I was just cooking one day and I just thought like workspace salvation. I just started cracking up. I was like, because everyone uses this phrase based online when it's like the inverse of debased, and what's funny is I've only ever used that phrase one time. I was referencing Bluey, the kids' cartoon show, and I said "Bandit is base." It's the only time I've ever used it. So I actually don't like it as a phrase. Like, it's not my cup of tea. I think it's overused, and actually I think it's kind of trite. However, it is common parlance right now. And but the whole idea of like workspace, my thought was, okay, when I was like cooking dinner for my family while I was thinking of this, and I was just like, it would tickle the right people and offend the it would tickle the right people and offend the right people at the same time. And I was just like, oh, it's too good. So I told my wife that. She's like, that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's compelling.
So and then what the best part of this the story in my opinion was my pastor, Steve Jeffrey, who's a wonderful guy. He's speaking at the conference. He's been helping me. So I came to him and I was like, hey, as my pastor, do you think this is a good idea for me to do? And he's like, yeah, I think so. And I was like, okay, well, now individually, I'd like to ask you to join us. I'd like you to speak at the conference. So he's been helping me organize it and so he's like kind of shepherding me at kind of in a unique way. And so I was like, well, I want to run this by him, because if he rejects workspace, we won't do it. And if he thinks it's okay, then we'll go with it. And so he's this like British, he's not uppity, but he's British, and he's got a cup of tea, and he's become more salt of the earth since he's moved to Texas, but he's definitely like a high church kind of guy. And I told him the name. I was like, hey, ready for this? And he just fell out of his chair laughing. It's the hardest I've ever seen him laugh. And I was like, well, is that a good laugh or is it a bad laugh? He's like, I love it. It's fantastic. And so we were like, okay, we're off to the races on it. And so the actual theological reason behind it is James 2, faith without works is dead. So the idea is that the tagline we've been using is, we're not saved by good works. We're saved by Christ for good works. So I think the more Reformed Protestant view of works is that you're given a faith that's not our own, lest any man should boast. But then that faith is also paired with good deeds and good works, and none of which is for our glory, but is to be given back to God in his glory. So the idea was, I think it's actually tongue in cheek. It's very edgy, but I think the idea was more or less to get to a point, which is like, we're not materialistic. Christians shouldn't be anti-materialistic either. we are called to take the resources God has blessed us in creation and take the garden into the garden city. And so there's some eschatological, I'm post-mill guy, so there's
Let's go.
views I have on certain things. So, but
we've evened it out.
You got the most condensed. Yeah. Okay. There you go. So that's kind of the long and short of it. Is basically my idea is that work is something that is uniquely called to humans. That's part of the dignity I think that God has bestowed upon us that you see in Genesis, and we, unlike other creations, are called to reflect the Lord in a very specific way, which is we're called to create. Now, we don't create nothing into something. We take what's been given to us and invest it back into we take what God has given us material wise and do something with it. So, the phrase I've heard before is taking the garden into the garden city, which I said is going to go. So that's kind of the idea.
Effectively, you're pushing back on the notion that our good works amount to reading our Bible, praying, going to church. Those are good works that God has prepared for us to walk in. But those are not the only works that God has prepared for us to walk in. A lot of those works are brushing your teeth. Like John Piper will talk about drinking orange juice to the glory of God, right? Eating breakfast, even cooking breakfast for your family. Or like you were talking about, dinner for your family, going to work and doing a good job faithfully. That is one of those works that God's called you to. And it's not just spiritual discipline. I'm not dunking on your sermon from Sunday, Bradley. I agreed with everything.
Well, now I feel like I'm out of the loop. Can I pause and go listen to it?
Sure, absolutely.
I saw Bradley kind of furrow his brow. Like, is he talking about me? No, I'm not talking about you. Yep. But Christians, humans, are called to significantly more than just, quote unquote, just worship, Bible reading. Like God has given us things to do in the world that really matter.
Yeah, and I think that I was kind of alluding this to earlier, and I haven't worked out all my own personal thoughts on some of this, but like, for example, I struggle with the idea of like anti-material and materialistic. Mm-hmm. Like there's a dichotomy to it. And the reason I say that is I think that a lot of Christians, we've kind of slipped away from the Reformation. So a lot of the idea of like the only holy work is living in the monastery or being a priest. That's like very pre-Reformation stuff. Not forever, but like right before the Reformation. Right. That there was about 400, 500 years where that was a big problem. And of course, Luther and all the other reformers kind of helped us out with that. But we've kind of slipped back into that. And I think that part of it's an eschatological thing. Part of it's also a rejection of materialism in one way, but then it's also kind of what I call an anti-material thing in the sense of like, let's go do mission work. Mm-hmm. Right? Like mission work is so holy because, well, nothing really matters, right? Like there's kind of an element of like, we're not called to build institutions anymore. Nobody's sitting around really talking about building the next big monastery or the next big church or the next big cathedral, partially because I think we've had this rejection of capitalism in the West. And so, even in churches where you have good God-fearing Christians who are not like, Marxist or anything like that, they just don't realize how much the water that we're in culture wise has affected us to the point where we just reject the idea of like people. I mean, how many evangelicals do you know will say something like all the money put into that building that big church, you could have just gone and funded missions. Like people say that all the time as if these are the same things, or as if the investment into the big building is not the same as like the spiritual nature of people's souls. And there's just a weird dichotomy of that because it's clearly not, first off, it's not really applicable. A big church is going to obviously minister to people too. And funding missions in Africa, while important, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get like, people automatically saved for that. So part of my whole project is really trying to get Christians to start thinking in these ways again. And again, I'm along with people for the ride. I'm not saying I've got to figure it out. That's why I'm bringing in speakers. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm not talking at my own event, because I want to hear from people so we can start thinking about these things more realistically. But to kind of get back to what you're saying is like, yeah, we have to get there. Christians have gotten to this point where we think mission work, being in the being a pastor or the wife of a pastor or something like that, this is the only holy work. Mm-hmm. And it's just not true. It's clearly not true.
I can see the gears turning in your head, Bradley.
I like that.
No, I like it. That's good. It's interesting. my wife and I just this morning finished reading through Ecclesiastes.
I finished it a couple weeks ago.
And
That's funny.
I told my wife sitting on our back porch this morning, I said, as we come to the end of this, it feels somewhat like Jesus when he turns to a group of people and says, unless you hate your father, mother, brothers, you have no part of me. And we know what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about that, love for him. He's not saying that we should literally hate our family in the sense that we typically understand hate. It's just that, love for him relativizes all other loves to the point that it might seem like the gap between our affection for Jesus and our affection for family would only be like described as hate.
Right.
Solomon seems to do the same thing with life. It's like the wisest, richest, most prolific womanizer in human history says it's all vanity.
Mm-hmm.
It's folly.
Yeah.
Everything. Like he indulged to a level that our carnal nature only dreams about. And he goes, it's all vanity. And then he comes to this conclusion, which, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle, but it seems like this might be in the same trajectory as what your conference is about, is he says, it's good for man to eat, to drink, enjoy his labor, and fear God. And I think the emphasis falls on fear God and do these things because there's so much you can't control. Cast your bread upon the water, take risk, invest, do this because you can't control the wind. You can't control the rain. If you wait for everything to be perfect, you're not going to get anything done. Mm-hmm. And then if you bank on, if your whole life becomes about, compiling wealth, if that's your goal in and of itself, then that's a waste. That's folly. And yet there is it, and I don't think that Solomon would say that it's a waste to leave an inheritance to your children or to build a business or whatever, but it's just like, fear God and steward what he's entrusted to you well in the fear of him, which includes not only our labor, but I think also our enjoying our days. Yeah. And Solomon also talks about good works. So that's just kind of what's, I'm not in any way disagreeing with what this conference is about. It's just my wheels are turning about what we've been reading in the mornings.
I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah. No, I think we're right on the money. I think, the interesting thing is, so I'm going through Psalms with my son, and then I just finished Ecclesiastes not all that long ago, and it wasn't a super intensive study. It was just kind of going through it. But the one thing I find with Psalms and Ecclesiastes is they're very much like poems in the sense of like, I don't know if Solomon, so I don't disagree with you, but I do wonder how much of what he's saying is more just like he's just spilling out his heart. It's not necessarily there's a theology here. So the same thing with the Psalms in the sense of like, I think this is just, the book is there to teach us very important things. There's obviously some prophecy and there's a lot of other stuff buried in the Psalms, but I think it's also just meant to show us like, it is okay to have this kind of relationship with God. It is okay to be like with Ecclesiastes, it's okay to be melancholy. Now, obviously there's a lot of rich theology that's derived from that, but, so I think we share in the same sense that I don't think Solomon is literally saying like, who cares? Like just burn everything down. Just, it doesn't matter anything. But he is saying that there's a vanity found in when, and I often wonder with Ecclesiastes, like was Solomon still sleeping around or did he kind of like, all right, I tightened it up and this is,
I wonder that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it would make, it could either or would make sense. It could make sense that he's like caught in wicked sexual sin and he's still writing this stuff because I think about like my own struggles and I'm like, I look at myself as like this dog eating vomit when I'm struggling with sin. And yet I still could say those same kind of things that he says, or it's at the end of his life and he recognizes the follies he's made. But either way, I think that for all of that, Solomon still built the temple, right? Yep. He built the temple and it was a glory both for the Israelites, but also for God. And so it honored and glorified God. And so I think we're just called to do the same thing. We're not called to just sit up here and, hold on to every card until there's no cards left to play. Andrew Crapshitz, one of my speakers, has a phrase. He says, oh crap, I just forgot it. But he basically just says, like, when the music chair stops, you're not going to be, you're not going to go into heaven carrying your chair with you. Like, you need to cash out everything before you leave out. And some of that should obviously be leaving an inheritance for your children and their children's children. But also, it really should be like, you've invested as much as you can. You've tried to take all the resources and talents God's given you and put them back into the world.
One question I might ask you, Kyle, is like, how are you planning to? I mean, you mentioned the water that we swim in, the culture that we're in, which includes the American dream. Like, what, how is that going to get talked about at your conference, or is it? In terms of, like, to me, there's a distinction between the American dream and stewarding all things for the glory of God. What?
Yeah, I would say.
No. Go ahead.
If you have more.
No, go ahead.
So this is, I don't know if we have anything that like kind of hits that nail in the head, but one of the things that I kind of is a hobby horse of mine is kind of pushing against soft socialism that we see in the church, or see in the world, in the West. Like, where do we get the idea of like a 40-hour work week? Where do we get the idea of 5 days a week? Where do we get 9 to 5 and all that stuff? That's more of just like a hobby horse of mine. But I think that while that stuff is socialistic, there's a relation it has. The reason it crept up in America is because of selfish, individualistic desire that is rooted deeply in America. And so I love my country. I'm a Texan by transplant, but I love my country. I love my state. I love my city. But I would say that when you study the America, we lost our way somewhere post Civil War. It seems like we got rid of the family started to dissolve, covenants started to dissolve. There was a bunch of problems that we have in the country. And I don't want to get into a whole history thing, although I'm happy to discuss it if anyone wants to. But I would just say that where I want to push back on like core American fundamental stuff. So not surface level stuff, not like the soft socialism stuff that's popped up in the last 20, 30, 50 years, but the core stuff is pushing back against individualism, because I think that's really destroyed our country. And part of it's based on how we came into founding. Part of it's our ethos. There's a lot of reasons it exists, but we need to push back on it. Like, we need to get back to ideas of covenant. We need to get back ideas to community. We need to get back to all those sorts of ideas. And so I would like to push back on that. The only talk that we're going to have that I think will address it in maybe not an overall capacity, but at least in some capacity, is C.R. Wiley is going to give a talk on, his talk is called Against the Recreational Household. And so he wants to talk about what the household is and what it isn't. And I think that will touch on some of it, but some of these topics are things I'm planning for like our next project and kind of where we're going with the brand as a whole, and maybe a conference next year would be discussing some of these, like for example, hyper capitalism, the idea of, like, I'm not so convinced that this whole startup model, like, I'm going to build a software company just to sell it. I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't know if we should be encouraging that. It's certainly lawful. I'm not denying that. But is it wise? Is it practical? Like, there's some things to say about that. I don't know if we're ready to address it right away, but it's stuff that I want that to be in our, in the community I'm trying to build. I want that to be discussions, because I want to hear both sides of it. I want to hear what's good ideas and bad ideas, but I really, to kind of your point, I really do want to push back on the individualism that I see in the West, because it is pretty rotten. Even if it's led to some good things, it's pretty wicked.
John, we haven't heard from you a whole lot, and we need that epic voice of the Augsburg Admiral in our ears.
I find the concept of a conference around this, it's not just a topic, but right, it's an ethos, it's a philosophy. I find it compelling. It's something that had I not been going on a camp out that weekend, I would absolutely do my best to get down there for. Before we started rolling on the episode, Kyle, you and I were talking about kind of future plans for this conference. Why don't you kind of bring that back up and talk about, well, we have this conference. How are you going to bring this and this kind of body of thought to more people in a more relational format?
Well, I guess I don't mind announcing it here.
Oh, well, I mean, we could just
no, it's totally fine.
I didn't
no, it's totally fine.
I didn't sign anything.
So part of my whole idea with this conference was I don't want to get into how we came to start it and do all that, but long story short, and Cody can kind of attest to this, is like I'm kind of by nature a connector and a networker. And so it was actually pretty easy to kind of get the right people in place to put this on. And I've got some experience putting on events. I used to be a pro wrestling promoter. Here's one of my
pro wrestling to the glory of God. I love it.
Amen, brother. But yeah, so I used to do that, and so I've got some experience doing that. And so this was all kind of easy to put on, more or less.
Sure.
But where we want to go with this, and kind of one of the main desires behind the conference, was just interpersonal connection. So I'm by nature a very outward person. I'm in sales, so I network with people. I'm open to just cold calling people. That's just kind of my nature. And I want to, not everyone needs to be like me, but I do think pre-COVID and post-COVID, I think most people recognize that between social media, work life, and a bunch of other things, people are just way less connected than they used to be. And so, and I don't think this is strictly a COVID thing. I think COVID made it worse and maybe highlighted it in some specific ways. But I can think of like our previous church we were at, we never saw people outside of church. The church we're at now, we just moved closer to, and we want to live in the neighborhood. We're trying to even get closer. We see people from the church probably. If I'm on a phone call with somebody at church or just talking whatever, we're seeing people pretty regularly. And I think that a lot of people have that intrinsic desire to be more connected. Where we want to go with Workspace is we do want to do a conference again next year. We're trying to figure out the date, so it's a little bit more better for people's schedules. But the other thing is we're thinking about doing more hyper or like regional hyper small events. So like 30, 50 people in a local context where it's like, let's get some business people together. Let's get some entrepreneurs together. Let's get some people together that want to build and work together. And we'll just do a small afternoon, some psalms, some singing, some worship, then get to work, learn some things, network with some people, have a couple speakers, that whole thing, and then do some beer and psalms to close it and just have a good time. That's kind of what we're thinking is the next step. We're trying to figure out some partnerships with that. We're trying to figure out some relationships that may be able to make that happen. But we think that that's going to be a pretty interesting connection point with people, because obviously the more small regional events we have across the country, we can start connecting people like, oh, you need a payment processing guy. Well, I know a guy in Huntsville, Alabama, and you need marketing. Well, great. I know this guy in Louisiana that can do that. And so that's kind of where we want to go. And it's the desire is really just to grow a networking thing. And I don't want to open a can of worms with this, but I'm happy to discuss it. But I'm not a big fan of like the pushing for the parallel economy, as people call it.
That makes sense.
For a variety of reasons. We all are still using our iPhones and Androids. Good luck with your parallel economy until that stuff like that's figured out. But I want to strive for what I call the eschatological economy. So again, I'm a post-mill guy. I think 10 years before Christ returns, there's only going to be Christian businesses. So I want to labor towards that. And so part of how we do that is we got to get people connected. LinkedIn, Facebook, even Twitter to some degree. These platforms are not helpful towards people wanting to build conservative businesses and work together. Right. So we got to start figuring out ways to get people connected. I want to build a website, but I only know secularists or liberals that'll do that. Oh, here's your guy in Louisiana, so on and so forth. So that's kind of where we're trying to go.
Yeah, I really like that and appreciate that. It prioritizes, perhaps not primarily, but as a result, it prioritizes some permanency in a craft or in a trade. right? So, obviously within the learned trades and the skilled trades like plumbing and electrician and things like that, you see people stay in those roles for a very long time, and you move up through those ranks in that skill set. However, I'm in, you mentioned a website, right? Or payment processors. Like I too am in the tech industry. And what strikes me, being a good old Midwestern boy, is that there are people my age who are senior directors, VPs, senior VPs, and more of some really, Fortune 500, other Fortune 500 tech companies. And here I am, just as management, right? And I take a look at their career path. And don't get me wrong, I've been substantially blessed through my career, although not as flexible to get on and record the podcast as I once was. But what I've noticed is, if I look at the careers of others, in most cases, they career hop until they or company hop until they get where they want to go. So you're at somewhere for 2 years as and you're an engineer, and then you go to senior engineer, and then maybe you switch over to management, and then you get director, and you get a promotion every single time you move companies. So there's a incentivization of really being fungible. And what a terrible way to build relationships, right? There's no time for that. There's time for you to ramp up, make some good decisions, and then leave. But you're never building those relationships with the people that you're currently working with, let alone building a long-time relationship with whatever company it is, right? That you've chosen to align yourself with. So like I said, may not be a primary intention here, but being able to work with others in these various different industries that you might find yourself in need of incentivizes that person to stay in that industry. It's like, well, you know what, I could switch, but you know what, I've been helpful to others in this industry, and I've talked to more people who want me to be helpful for them. And I don't know, that's been on my mind lately with some churn at my company. And so the parallels there are interesting.
Well, and that kind of gets back to the thing. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, which is, like what I call, like hyper capitalism, this idea of like just everything's for sale,
right.
Turn a profit on anything. And it's like, I was talking to a guy that, he's a friend of mine, but he has a roofing company, and we were talking about like he's done really well for himself in a short amount of time, and we were just talking about like what are your plans, and he's like basically he would dissolve the company, and just so he can split the inheritance evenly, and it's like, okay, on one hand, like yeah, that kind of makes sense, but on the other hand, like, well, you just build something and you're going to turn around and just let it fall apart. Like there's something strange about that. The company I work for, the owner made it. His son works for the company. He's a great dude. I love talking to him. But the owner made it a employee owned company. He basically sold the company to a trust he made, and now I'm part owner. And it's like it's just there's like I appreciate why he did it, but at the same time, it's like it makes you think like what has gone not wrong, but like what has led people to forget that not community so much, but like going back to what you're talking about, the idea of working for a company for 30 years is just foreign to people. Right. I've been at this company for 10 years, and it's kind of an anomaly. It's just kind of strange.
Yeah, same time frame for me as well. When I bring more people in or introduce myself, they're like 10 years. Like you see their eyes get big. I'm like, it's 10 years. Like
right. I mean, this is people used to work at places for forever, and be fine. But I think it goes both ways. And like so, for example, my 10-year anniversary is coming up in a few months, and I'm not expecting like a gold watch or anything because I've never seen them do that here. Well, on one hand, that's kind of not bad on the company. Again, they're not required to do that. But on another hand, this is kind of the catch 22 of things. Like you're not really showing particular loyalty to me. Not that I'm not criticizing my company by any means. I'm just saying as an example, if a company were to say like, hey, like, great, you've been here for 10 years, here's a little plaque, cool. Versus me, who's like, I've been there for 10 years, but I'm going to go jump somewhere else. It's like, there's kind of a lack of loyalty. But I think even like me saying that, people in the West kind of react, like even super reform types will react to the idea of like company loyalty. They'll react to it like, oh, well, brother, you're allowed to go do whatever you want. And it's like, well, that we're not talking about what you're allowed to do. We're talking about how God has wired us. And there's something off in the last, 30, 40, 50 years, certainly like right now, just how people are wired where they don't want to stay with a company or stay in a trade or stay in a career. There's just something off with that. I can't really, and it's not a sin thing. It's just something's funky, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a restlessness, I think. And
yes.
that feeling, I think, extends into so many things, whether it be altered attention because of our, unlimited access to whatever the heck we want, whenever the heck we want it, or whether it be the tendency of youth to not stick and kind of progress through difficult things and would rather pivot to something that's maybe a little less difficult. I mean, there's this combination of restlessness and a lack of resiliency. And you're right. It's not one thing, but it's just this body of murkiness that just doesn't sit right. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Well, and it's almost like in so many ways we have preference cascades. So I think about my son, he's 3, and like he wakes up in a day. We're trying to make sure we're getting him on like a more regular schedule of like, at this time you're going to do this, and at this time you're going to do this, and at this time you're going to do this, and then in the afternoon you kind of have some freedom. But even like him, he has access to toys and games and all sorts of things that I didn't, and certainly probably my dad and my grandfather probably didn't. And I don't think that's bad of me as a parent for doing that, but it is one of those things that like we are teaching our kids that at any given point you have access to all these options. And again, that's not a sin thing to me, but here's what I equate it to. So again, I'm post-mill, third time saying it. Sorry, I won't say it again.
We have a drinking game around here that every time I say that I'm post-mill, everybody takes a shot. so
okay.
I miss the optimistic. I miss the optimistic Amel day. Yeah, that used to be Cody.
But for me, it's like, so like, for example, like I think social media is like, it's just kind of an inevitability. The idea of like connecting people. I mean, we're able to have this conversation in part because of social media. This is just this is a blessing of technology, is that we're able to record this. Right. But I don't think Christians, I don't think the West, I don't think humans have learned how to deal with social media.
I've been saying that for years,
because we have it. Right. So what related to that is kind of just this overall preference cascade that I think that it is a blessing that the Industrial Revolution and really what's just happened in the West over the last 20, 30 years in terms of like, you can work remote, you can do this, you can do this, you can do all these different things. It is great that you have options. That is a blessing from God. However, we as the human race, but even as the church, we're not dealing with it well. We don't have the responsibility. We don't have the discipline to deal with these sorts of things well. And I think this relates back to it. It's like, why do people not have loyalty? Well, because we're not instilling it. We're not instilling loyalty into our children. We're not instilling loyalty in our churches. So when the marketplace and the government reflects bad loyalty, well, why are we surprised? The church is sinning first. We're not teaching these in our churches. So there's an element of that, the preference cascade is, like I said, I think is a big part of it, and we're just not dealing with it well. So, I'd like to see people return back to, work at a job for 20, 30 years, help build it up, get some stock, get some bonuses in the company, and be able to retire well. But also, if guys want to go start their own company, I think that's a good thing too. I do think the guys that bounce around, it's like, again, not that there's anything wrong with it, but it does make you kind of want to pry back. It's like, why are you bouncing around all the time?
It's lawful, but it's like, what's going on here? And
what's in the heart that causes this?
Absolutely.
And, so that's
one of the interesting things that pops up with this podcast, because particularly when John can't make it, a lot of times it turns into Bradley and me discussing kind of what's going on here at our church. And we're in Hebrews 10 with verse 24, let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works. Mm-hmm. And that's so much of what this conference is. It just happens to be focused on business, on working hard, providing stuff like that. And especially with some of the guests that you have, like Andrew Krapuschetz of Red Balloon, of David Bonson, who I just saw is managing $5.3 billion worth of assets. Like what a dude.
Yep.
And by the way, his book Full Time is fantastic. Everybody needs to go read it. And then even someone like Darren Doan, you talk about like OG Christian DIY punk rock guy. Like people don't realize how influential he's been in not just Christian music, but music in general with all the music videos he's produced. My goodness. You have an all-star lineup there. So where can people find out more about this conference? When is it? Where is it? And if people can't make it, will there be live streaming available?
No live streaming, unfortunately, but we are going to release the content.
Fair.
So and I will say, there are a lot of people that have asked us to live stream. We actually have a couple people coming from the UK, and there's going to be more, but then they were like, it's too cost prohibitive. But the reason we didn't want to stream it, we could have. There's some cost stuff with it, but the real reason we didn't want to do it is because we do want people to come back in the future and say, I'll come back to this, because the networking and the interpersonal part of it is the thing you'll be missing out. The talks are great. It's definitely having a leading direction. But if you're missing out at the business opportunity and just even the fellowship, like we're doing Beer and Psalms on Friday night, I expect that to be a really fun opportunity and just meet some people from different congregation that do, blue collar guys hanging out with white collar guys. Like we want all of that. But we want people to experience that. So that's why it's in part why we're not live streaming it, but we will release the talks because I think they're going to be excellent. But to get information, it's June 28th and 29th right here in Fort Worth, Texas. Not too far from the DFW airport if you still want to consider flying in. But the tickets are going to be at worksbased.com. I'm still surprised we got this URL, but that is worksbased.com.
The Catholics didn't beat you to it.
Nope. So we got that one. And of course you can follow us on all the socials because we got works based on everything. So one of the few times in my professional entrepreneurial career that I was able to secure all the what do you call it? The IPs.
That's awesome.
For the same brand. So, but yeah, June 28th and 29th at the end of this month, tickets are still on sale. We've got plenty of opportunities. We got a few vendor spots if anyone's got a business in the area and they would like to get some sponsorship opportunities. But yeah, it's going to be a great weekend, and we're excited for the future too, because it does seem like there is a desire. Like we've definitely hit something in the market spot, and part of it's just we need to get more branding out there. We need to get more people to be aware of this, which is why I appreciate coming on the Westminster Effects podcast to discuss it.
Yes, sir. Bradley, John, final thoughts, and then Kyle will leave it with you on the last thought, and we'll sign off here.
Ooh.
Oh, that's good.
Bradley, all yours. Yeah.
No, it's good. I enjoyed talking with you, Kyle. It's great.
Thank you, guys. No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. This is all to the glory of God. I mean, I was talking to a guy earlier. I'll just briefly end with this. He was talking to me about like, why is it not a 401c3? And it's like, well, because part of the whole conference is like, we're presenting business opportunities and he's being presented as a business. So this is like my family project right now. I'm doing this like in after our works. And so I've appreciated every opportunity to come on people's podcasts and just talk about and promote it. But I hope people recognize that, certainly this is to the glory of God, that doing a podcast well is glorifying God. Building a well-sounding amp or effects pedal is to the glory of God. Putting on a conference is to the glory of God. Selling signs or doing whatever you may do. I'm just listing stuff I do and you guys do, but our work reflects God. And if we do our work well, that's good. So while it is important for people to witness at work, like we all want that, Christians, do not forget that your character in the workplace and how you do your job well reflects the glory of God as much as it does evangelizing. So all glory to God in all things. And again, thank you guys for having me on.
Love it. Kyle, thanks for coming on. And to everybody else, go love God, love your neighbor, make some music. We'll see you next time.